Hello, hello, hello. It's Danny, and today I have a presentation for you that's very important. It's about violence and aggressive behavior in the workplace. Now, these things are unacceptable. Some of it will be pretty obvious, I think. Some maybe not as much. So I'm going to go through some of the ways that violence can manifest in the workplace and talk about some of the consequences that will follow from violent or aggressive behavior. Project Search UTMC Remote Learning presents One Strike, You're Out! Actions that will lead to immediate termination from a job. Part 1, Violent or Aggressive Behavior. According to OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, workplace violence is any act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening, disruptive behavior that occurs at the worksite. So you'll see I have some pictures here. One is a person who seems to be throwing a fist in an act of violence, and then the other picture shows someone yelling at another person, and it looks pretty violent or threatening. Project Search UTMC, as well as any employer you work for in the future, prohibits violent behavior, whether that behavior involves physically harming others or threatening to harm others. This presentation will address forms of workplace violence and the consequences that can result from it. One form of workplace violence should be obvious. Actions that are intended to harm another person physically. Some examples of those would be punching, pushing, biting, and kicking. Again, these are probably pretty obvious. If you do any of these things, there's nothing the employer can do other than terminate your job, meaning fire you right away. It's just completely unacceptable to do any of these things in the workplace. Another form of workplace violence that can cause you to lose your job immediately is probably not as obvious as harming or attempting to harm someone physically. Instead, it involves making violent contact with objects in the environment. So let me give you some examples of that. Pounding your fists on the desk or tabletop. Sometimes people, if they get really angry, they might clench their fists, and rather than hurt another person, they may hit an object like a table or a wall. This can be considered violence and aggression, and it can lead to termination. In a similar way, punching a wall or a door or an object, that can be considered an act of aggression and violence. Kicking walls and doors, and anything else for that matter, will be considered violent and aggressive behavior. You can be fired immediately for doing any of these things. Again, even if you don't hurt somebody. Using threatening language, screaming, using profanity, or any combination of these can also lead to immediate termination from your job. So remember that if you get mad and you start to scream at somebody, you've already made a big mistake. Then if you start to use threatening language, telling the person you're going to hurt them in some way or other, or worse, and using profanity, any combination of any of that, you're going to lose your job. It just is not acceptable in the workplace to behave that way. So we're going to make sure that we don't. Warning. If you direct violent behavior towards someone in the workplace, there can be serious legal consequences for your actions, including a fine of up to $5,000, and you could serve up to 1 year in prison. So it's no joke. If you hurt somebody in the workplace, some serious things can happen with that. And then, of course, you're going to lose your job. And on top of that, having a criminal record can make finding a job significantly more difficult. To wrap things up today, here are some final thoughts. When we report to the workplace, we must refrain from violent behavior of any kind. What would you do if you started to feel as though you were losing control of your anger in the workplace? Now, what I'd like for you to do is think about that question very carefully. We have talked a little bit about anger management and some concepts with that. So you're at work, picture yourself in that scene at work. You're losing control. You feel anger coming on, and you're concerned about being able to control yourself. What would you do? So we'll be talking about this very soon. I'm looking forward to talking to you guys about this topic. It is quite serious. I want to reassure you that as we go through Project Search, in fact, quite soon, we will discuss ways to deal with extreme emotions like anger and frustration so that you don't get yourselves into trouble, basically, at the workplace or anywhere else, really. The rest of the week, we will also talk about those things that can get you fired right away from a job, basically. And all of the things that we'll talk about are also in the Project Search dismissal and suspension policy, which you should have a copy of. So make sure that you do. If you don't have a copy, let me know when we get together. Get ready because there'll be some quizzes during meetings just to make sure everyone's learning what they need to learn. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Project Search.